On January 3rd, 1979, it was pretty cold in Snohomish County, Washington. A duck hunter left his house to try to catch some good game to start his day. He was looking forward to catching a lot of ducks and fish when he noticed something strange. On the mudflats near the shore, the net caught something. Because he was curious, he went over to see what was going on. He started to feel scared as he looked around. It wasn't what he thought it would be. He had found the bones of someone. Those bones belonged to who? How did that person end up? Was it a mistake? Or was it something worse? Hi, and welcome back to Cold Case Diaries. If you're new here, please consider subscribing, as it helps us motivate to create more intriguing content for you. Let's have a look at the 44-year-old case finally solved in 2023, Gary Lee Haynie's case. Snohomish County, Washington is a foreign country where people don't walk by each other without saying hello, where the community is full to the brim with friends, or where the country's rich history and culture are woven into every building. Even though Snohomish County is the third most populous county in Washington, it feels like a small town and has a pretty low crime rate. Its beauty is shown by the beautiful scenery, farms, and the happy faces of the people who live there and enjoy being safe and comfortable. When a place is nice, simple, and full of possibilities, like a place where skeletal remains have been found, it's hard to imagine that a puzzle would start here that would take decades to solve. People in Snohomish County did not have a good time in 1979. It felt as cold as ice. Both the temperature and the number of snowflakes were the highest that had ever been measured. The whole state of Washington had a cold spell. But January 3rd, 1979 was unlike every other day. Everyone could finally breathe again when the sun came up in the morning. It felt like it was getting warmer than 0 degrees. People felt safe enough to leave their homes for the first time in a week because the temperature was above freezing. At the western end of North Spencer Island, where two sloughs met Puget Sound, he got to the mouth of the Snohomish River. He mostly thought about where to find ducks when he saw something strange. He saw that there were human bones when he looked at them closely. The cops were called right away. When the cops arrived at the scene near Everett, Washington, it made them feel cold. Because it was true, the duck hunter's story was scary. 10 pairs of pants, a low-weather quarterback shoe, and a piece of human leg bone were caught on a fishing line. But that wasn't all that was caught. During the first investigation, the duck hunter took the police a little to the west. They found a red, orange, white, and gray checkered shirt 5 feet away from a human head, ribs, and a shoe with a foot still in it. It was frightening and terrible to see. When the police went back to the scene to look for more signs, they found a leather wallet that had stayed dry in the salty water, but whatever was in it was long gone. They didn't have any money, a driver's license, or a fishing ticket. A sog and a 33 to 43 size belt were also found in the same place. As the police looked over the evidence, they saw that the shoes found there had laces and the numbers 30 and 38 on them. But O'Sullivan's name was written on the shoes' rubber heels. The green pants had a tag that said they didn't need to be cleaned and were made in the United States. Even though this seems like a small thing, it could be the only way to find out who the man is. Even though the case seemed complex, there was no reason to think something bad had happened. It was hard to tell what had happened to the man without a name from what was left of him. When the investigation began, the people in charge had a tough job. Since the person had been dead for a long time, it might not be easy to find simple replies. They gave the body parts to a doctor so he could find out as much as possible. The doctor told them that the body parts came from a man who had been dead for a few months, but it didn't make it any easier to find the man's name. But it was at least a start. The coroner's office did everything it could to figure out who the man was. They said that they should keep track of his teeth and look at his body to find the answers they were looking for, but the records were too worn down by time to keep in good shape. In 1979, the cops couldn't figure out who the man was, no matter how hard they tried. So the puzzle of this unknown man became a John Doe case when Snohomish County coroner at the time, Robert Phillips, gave the man the name John Doe 791 and wrote that the cause of death could not be found because there were so few clues. It was almost impossible to find out who the 1979 John Doe was. So, on March 15, 1979, after about 2.5 months of waiting, the unknown man was laid to rest in a nice grave at Everett Cypress Memorial Park. Bone parts are kept in the office of the medical examiner until they are claimed by a family member or until they can be recognized. Still, the investigation did not end there. They still had a long way to go. The police and everyone else in the area were looking for clues about who John Doe was. Still, none of the clues led anywhere. So the agents gave up, and the case was over. The case had been over for years, and nearly all of the proof had been lost. In 2008, Jim Scharf, a deputy for the sheriff's office, and Kent Cassert, a former judge for the Superior Court, looked through old files that had been sitting around for decades. This is how the 1979 John Doe case came up again. After all those years, when the case filed for John Doe was finally answered in 1979, the officers couldn't help but feel frustrated. The information was checked, but it wasn't enough to know if the original investigation had matched the description of the unknown man with any of the missing people from that time. They were left wondering how many tips had been followed up and how many had been thrown away. It was a wake-up call that the material had been lost before it could be turned into something else. But the cops did not stop trying. In 2008, they really started to look into it. They looked through old records to see if there was anything that could help them figure out who the dead person was. It had been around 36 years since the guy was found in the mudflats. Investigators were still trying to figure out who the man was, even though it was 2015. At the time, there were a lot of John and Jane Doe cases, so the Snohomish County Police gave John Doe 1979 a new name, Spencer Island John Doe. In July 2015, the cops asked the Snohomish County judge if they could dig up the body of John Doe on Spencer Island. After being asked, they took the body to the medical inspector's office. There, forensic odontologist Dr. Kyle Tanaka thought that uploading the man's teeth records to national databases would shed light on a few missing people reports that might be a match. But it didn't work out that way. In August 2015, the case was added to NamUs lists of missing people. Still, nothing happened. The spies did everything they could to think of to find the truth. They looked at his clothes, wallet, and belt, which they had found before, and saw that he wore clothes that had been worn before. The Snohomish County sheriffs asked the people who lived there to say something if they knew anything about the unknown man. Even though finding the person quickly was a big goal, the police were almost on the verge of a big break when they got a tip in late 2015. It happened because the police got an unexpected tip that said Spencer Allen John Doe looked like a farmhand who had gone missing in Marysville. A cop got a good-looking tip after a long time, so they had to check it out. The man who ran a fruit stand in Everett was always drunk, and everyone knew it. People said that he had a bad limp and that he went missing in late 1970s. The cops were about to figure out what was going on when they got the tip. They worked hard for a month as agents, but when they found a tombstone in Yuma, Arizona, they were crushed. Using billiongraves.com, they were able to figure out that it belonged to the same farmhand whose tip they had gotten. In 1981, he died in the desert area of the southwestern United States, where he was headed. After the loss, the police couldn't help but feel like the case wasn't going anywhere. As people looked for clues at the crime scene, the medical examiner's office made a second set of very important finds. They learned important things about the man that helped them identify him for sure. Dr. Kathy Taylor, a forensic scientist who works in Washington State at the King County Medical Examiner's Office, looked at the bones after they were found in April 2016. She could do this because she had a good eye and had worked in the field for years. She thought he was probably between 27 and 61 years old. She guessed that he was between 5 feet 1 and 5 feet 7 tall. In his report, the forensic scientist said that the Spencer Island John Doe was either Native American, Caucasian, or a mix of both. So when people from the Tulalip and Siligamas tribes went missing, the police paid more attention to the stories and sent out reports. The information provided was both excessive and insufficient to form a coherent and meaningful story. They looked at a lot of information and found no signs of perimortem trauma, which is an injury or trauma that happened right before or right after death. They made this decision because there were no new cuts and all of the old ones had been fixed. But when doctors looked at the bones, they saw something horrible. His left thigh bone was broken so badly that it couldn't be fixed. It hurt him and made it hard for him to walk. The reports also said that John Doe might have had temporomandibular joint disease, based on what they saw when they looked at his bones on Spencer Island. Bar joint syndrome is a painful disease that makes the jaw hurt. It didn't look like a doctor had ever fixed his broken leg, so he may have been in pain for years without anyone knowing. An X-ray showed that the middle third of the bone stuck out like the tip of an ice pick, and it was clear that he had always been in pain. It's almost like he was in a third world country or didn't want to get medical help. Jane Jorgensen, a detective at the office of the medical examiner, didn't seem to know what was going on because she didn't have any answers. Jorgensen and Sharp talked about possible solutions with a retired judge, Kenneth Cossert, and a former parole supervisor, Chuck Wright, at the sheriff's office. Given how his body looked, it was getting harder and harder to figure out what killed him. Many different ideas were there. They thought that when he was hurt, he might not have been able to see a doctor. But this seemed more like a desperate guess than a good idea. It could also mean that he died on the boat and just happened to wash up on the beach. Other sailors might have buried him at sea. Over time, and because of erosion, his body may have been moved down the river to where Steamboat and Union sloughs met and ended up in the tide flats west of the railroad bridge on State Road 529. Snohomish County sheriffs thought that he might have accidentally fallen overboard and drowned. Around where the body was found in the mud, the officers had followed every lead and talked to every possible witness. Even though they kept hitting dead ends, they didn't give up. They turned to forensic art as a last-ditch effort to figure out what was going on. In April 2016, forensic artist Natalie Murray put his face back together by gluing rubber pegs onto his old head and trying to figure out what he might have looked like when he was living. Natalie noticed that he had flat lips and a small nose. These features were similar to those of people with Asian roots, but the bones had worn down over time, so it was hard to prove this idea with facts. She didn't give up, so she used his lower jaw to make up other traits because she had nothing better to do. She used what she knew to make a drawing she thought would help solve the case. Dr. Kathy Taylor, a forensic scientist, looked at the sketch and agreed that it looked like it was made by someone who was half Native American and half Caucasian, which was what was needed. In 2018, a bit of the right leg was sent to a national database at the University of North Texas. The DNA was taken and used to update the FBI's CODIS database. The mtDNA and STR profiles were made with the help of improved DNA and were ready by March 2019. In the 1970s, a man with a noticeable limp who looked like the sketch was seen by a former police officer. In 2021, Spencer Island sent another piece of John Doe's leg to a private company in Texas called Othrem Labs. This project was paid for by DNAPsalms.com, a group that supports and funds DNA tests to help investigators and families find answers they've been looking for years or even decades. The police were getting close to finding one name with Adam Wilcox's help as a death investigator. Before they found Gary Lee Haynie, they worked hard and hoped for about 3 hours. They worked at the family tree and got in touch with his last living sister, whose DNA matched that of his real half-brother. After 44 years, on February 10, Snohomish County Medical Examiner Dr. Matt Lacey found out that Spencer Island John Doe was really Gary Lee. On September 23, 1950, a boy was born to Bernice Helen Schaefer, who was 28, and Joseph Dominique Conmeti, who was 37. He was born in Topeka, Kansas. A few months later, Gary's parents broke up, and his life was about to change in big ways. Around 1955, Gary's mother got married to a soldier named Sheldon Lee Haynie. Gary became Sheldon's son, and Sheldon gave him the name Gary Lee Haynie. Gary's step-cousin, Hal, who was now 71 years old, said there was something wrong with his brain that made people take notice. Gary's stepfather, Sheldon, got out of the military and went to work for Boeing in the Air Force. He moved his family from New York to Kansas many times. Haynie couldn't join everyone for the holidays because they lived too far away. In fact, as Gary got bigger, he just stopped being in family pictures. Even though Gary's family didn't see him very often, they were saddened by his sudden death. Because the Haynie family moved around a lot, Hal Thaney, who was Gary's step-cousin, has only met Gary twice in his life. But Hal had been putting together family history on an ancestry website for a long time, so he knew a lot about Gary's life as a child and an adult that he could share. Gary's cousin Hal said he thought Gary could have died from a number of things, such as falling, hitting his head on a rock, or having a medical problem. Now, police think that Gary lived with his stepfather in Everett because Sheldon lived there from the 1970s until 1990. He used to spend his winters in Baja California, which is in Mexico. Sheldon drove to Texas to see his nephew Thane in the middle of the 1980s. But what they were talking about had nothing to do with Gary. Hal told him that they had never talked about Gary. Just never happened. Sheldon Haynie lived in Oregon before he died in 1997. When it was found out that Sheldon had never told anyone that Gary was missing, it raised more questions than just worries. It opened up a lot of new questions and paths. As the investigation went on, the police began to find a web of lies and secrets that had been kept for a long time. They learned that Gary had not had an easy life at all. It had been filled with sadness, loss, and hard times. Hale's cousins, who lived in Arizona, helped him put out a quarterly magazine, even though they didn't talk much. He said, "When I thought about Gary, I felt pulled to do something about his grave." Gary's family had moved across the country, so even if it was scary to visit Gary's grave, it would give him peace after 44 years of not having a name, no family, and being alone. Gary Lee Haynie was still a mystery even after 40 years, just like he was when his body was found in 1979, or when he was younger and his family didn't know anything about him. When Gary's name was found out, it was like Pandora's box. It opened up a lot of new questions and sent the detectives down a rabbit hole of confusion and uncertainty. Even though they knew more about his past, they didn't know much about the last days of his life. That crucial piece of information that could explain his mysterious disappearance and tragic death. What do you think happened to Gary Lee Haynie? What do you think is the most likely cause of the broken leg? Tell us what you think in the comments. If you want to see more, like, comment, and follow. Stay safe until the next time, and thanks for watching.